Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad that you survived the traffic this morning. I know it was pretty tough. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much, actually, for KHDA for so kindly inviting me to Dubai. I've been here for nearly a week, and it's been fantastic, actually. I've had such a good time. My only sadness is I have to go home tomorrow, but I do hope to return. I'm going to take you through a story, really, a little bit about my background so you can put it into some context, and then about the journey that I've been making about how I might design a school or how we might design a school, and the aspects that I've been considering around that. Now, I'd like you to pay attention because there's going to be a prize. So there's a copy of my book. I'm going to ask a question at the end. So keep an eye on the prize. So just to kick off, I thought let's take you on my learning journey. The little fella there you see on your left, that is indeed me. And as you can see, I've grown into those ears. There was no surgery involved, I promise you. I know as a child, as a teenager, I was a bit worried about those things, and I used to sleep on one side for a long time and the other, but trust me, that is me. But the reason I put that picture up there, the 5-year-old, was because that's when you, in England at least, that's when you have to go to school. And I've often wondered, and spent probably the last 10 years, wondering why we send our kids to school. And actually, even now, I'm still not entirely sure. And so I'm going to take you on a little bit of that journey. Now, I was born in 1964. Don't do the maths, I'm old, I know. But I grew up in an era of the Apollo missions, going to the moon, what I would call the golden age of science fiction. You know, Star Trek classic, Doctor Who, Star Wars, all these things. It was a very exciting period for me. I was inspired. I mean, we talk about inspiring a generation. And I think for me, growing up at that time, watching the man land on the moon, and these, I mean, I can still remember some of the memories that I have are of those times. And I was incredibly inspired. I was also quite an unusual kid. I think these days you would describe me as having a spectrum disorder or something like that. We like to label these things. But the reality is human species is a spectrum. We have an unusual sense of like an arbitrary normal. My condition was really that I was incredibly obsessive in terms of having to know everything about a particular subject when it caught my attention. And astrophysics was just one of those, and chemistry was another. But as a consequence of that, my experience at school perhaps wasn't the best. Because it didn't really cater for my kinds of needs, which was to really dive deeply into subjects. And as a consequence of all that experience, I wanted to be an astronaut. Who wouldn't? Anybody else here want to be an astronaut? Yes! That's what Dubai needs. It's a manned space program. Come on. So I went to my careers office meeting. It was when you're 13 in England, you go to a careers meeting. And I went in there, and the careers lady said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I want to be an astronaut." So she thought I was joking and told me off. She said, "Well, I don't have a brochure for that." Because in those days, it was brochures. She says, "I have a brochure for a meat processing factory, a brick manufacturer," which actually sounded quite cool because I used to go to the clay pits and hot wire diggers and drivers and do all that kind of stuff and dig clay and just general naughty stuff like that. But I didn't really fancy making bricks for a living. But they also said that if I was good at math, I got good grades, here was a brochure for National Westminster Bank, and I could get a job as a bank clerk. And now, nothing wrong with any of those careers, but it wasn't for me. And it certainly wasn't like being an astronaut. So at 15, just before 15, I left school. And I didn't go back. Now, that doesn't mean I left education entirely. I've been very fortunate in my life. I'm quite a persistent person. And I managed to build a faculty of some of the best academics in the world who have helped me, even to today, with their generosity. So in some sense, I built my own university. But I learnt my own way. Some of the things I got up to, which probably led to my leaving school, were what I would class as entrepreneurial activities and unauthorized science projects. And we're just going to park that there, I think, for a second, and let's not go into that into too much detail. But I ended up, as a result, living in a squat for a bit. So anyone know what a squat is? A squat is a sort of a load of people break into a warehouse or a building and turn it into a habitable space. Full of hippies and interesting people, and that's the room that I lived in for a little while, shared it with a friend and so on. Living in a squat at 15 and a half is quite unusual, I think, even in England's standards, but it was an incredible learning opportunity for me. I met lots of young people there who were at university and were a lot older than me, and actually I quite enjoyed it, to tell you the truth. But my first job, ironically, given my background, was as a lab technician. So when I went to an interview at the Open University, they actually quite liked my story about what led to my expulsion from school and the fact that I knew my way around a chemistry set. And so they rewarded me with my first job, which was a lab technician looking after a laboratory and working in genetics research. And I think this was because when I was in my interview, and has anyone seen the film Trainspotting? Yeah? Do you know the interview where there's the guy Spud, yeah? And he's miles away and he's going, he's talking like really, really fast. It was like that. But it was about genetics, it was about herpetology, which studied reptiles and amphibians, about chemistry and so forth. And I ended up working with some really serious academics. And I was like really young. I mean, I was like 16, nearly 17. And it was inspiring. And we were working with these things. Sorry, it's early in the morning to put a picture of a fruit fly on there, but that's the sort of the where you start doing genetics research, usually on Drosophila, which is a fruit fly. But a lot of the work that we were doing there, and this is pre-genome project, was effectively mathematics, pattern determination, and so forth. And I had some ideas around how we could analyze some of these patterns and predict what might happen, and therefore test our research. Which the academics, of course, thought that was wonderful. They didn't have any barriers. My lack of degree was no barrier to this. So I ended up working with computers. And my first computer was this one. Check it out, right? Big. This took a big room, actually. This is a DEC VAX 11 with a PDP 11 front end. Don't worry if you never come across one of those things. But it's a big old thing, really. And the disk packs that you see at the top, you see little round things, these were in like an American washing machine. These were where you put your hand in and you twisted them around and you pulled them out. Massive, quite heavy disk packs. 178 megabytes. Whoa. That computer has a lot less power than your mobile phone. A lot less power than your mobile phone. But in those days, that was state of the art. So I had access to this, what was called a mainframe computer at a really young age. And it was great fun. That got me into the whole computing area, and particularly computing in education. Because while I was there, and become quite well known, because I was like the youngest kid in the university, and I looked like I must have been I didn't even shave till I was 30, so I looked like I was 12. And in fact, I ended up working for a computer company called Research Machines, who made this computer that you see there, which is a 380Z Z80 processor, massive thing, very heavy. And I'm not one of those kids, in fact. I was about a year older than those kids when that photograph was taken, because I used to go around showing people how to use and program those computers, and I used to develop educational software back in the early 1980s. I'd also teach young people how to program in things like Pascal and Modular 2 and all that kind of business. This is my business card. How many people here know what a telex is? It's always, actually no one wants to admit they know that because it's super old. Telex was like pre-fax machines. It was like if you had a really busy day and you were working with people overseas, you would send them a telex. It was like this big sort of teletype type thing. And if you did 3 or 4 telexes a day, that was a busy day. But it was, I put that up there just because of that. It just sort of shows the sort of the date and how technology has moved. Now, one of the things that happened to me early when I was working in Research Machines, this computer company, is I ended up meeting this gentleman. And the reason I'm standing in front of you today is because of this man. I had the job of driving him around. Seymour Papert, MIT, one of the artificial intelligence pioneers who worked with Marvin Minsky. I mean, they were partners on a lot of the early AI work. And also an educator. Any of you that know Logo as a programming language, this is the man behind that. So where I was, imagine, picture the scene, I'm around 17 and a half, I've got a blue mohawk and all that and various other kind of accoutrements, driving him around because I'm the demo guy to show people how to use Logo, while he's doing a talk because he's released a book called Mindstorms. If you haven't read Mindstorms, really it's worth reading, even though it's in the 80s, definitely worth reading. So I'm sitting there, I'm doing the demos, I'm driving around the country, we're having these conversations, and he's finding my story, how I ended up leaving school and the kind of things that I was doing, and my learning style, he found fascinating. And this is the sort of thing, this is what he was saying. His idea was that he was telling me about computing, how things would change in education, and how digital technologies would allow us to do away with the curriculum, do away with the segregation by age. It's always struck me as odd that we stream children by the year of manufacture as opposed to what they can do and their competencies, and do away with the idea of uniformity, the idea of one size fits all, and the way people learn. And so he thought that actually this was going to be, had I been born in the future, this would have been, my education would have been substantially different and more suited to me. And he lit a fire in me, an interest in how we could change, how we could transform learning and make it more accessible to more people in different ways that suited them. So I owe a great debt to this gentleman. He is also known for the educational philosophy known as constructionism, which comes from, he worked prior to this with Piaget and Vygotsky in constructivism, but his version was how you apply that philosophy into an educational environment. And he sees learning as a reconstruction, i.e. situating the learning, experiential learning, rather than simply a transmission of knowledge. Here is the content, here is the test. And this, to me, was how I'd done all of my learning, so I found very appealing. Some of the projects I worked on after that were things like the Doomsday Project. Anyone know what that big disc is? This is a video disc, a laser disc with 12-inch thing, and the Doomsday Project is where we put all the maps of the UK onto these video discs, and 1 million children sent photographs of their town and so forth, and we matched them all up. Incredibly ambitious project, of course, but this was like a super prototype of Google Maps in the early 80s. This is me. So I went from the squat to showing Prince Charles, explaining what a CD-ROM was in 1988. We did my first company. I was 21, and we built a company which was building applications and also technology around CD-ROM. A lot of the technology that's in your mobile phone came from our lab in Cambridge. We sold a lot of the patents to Philips, who then sold them to Apple. So we did video compression and all this kind of business, which became QuickTime. When I look at that photograph, he's got such a look on his face. I think he should be saying something like, "My precious," or something like that. But anyway, a funny picture. And then the 90s happened. Oh, missed the sound clip. Let me just go back there because the sound. Then the 90s happened. Today is the final day of the music industry. So the 1990s, I switched gear. We'd invented all this technology, and computer power had got to a point where we could do some really interesting things with computers. Before, in part of living in the squad, I was a punk musician and so forth. I had this wonderful interest in music and so forth, but I couldn't get into the music industry. So what I decided to do was disrupt it. And using the power of computers, I then ran a number of companies and organizations which set about pulling apart the record industry. One of my career, which I thought was going to be a career-defining moment, turned out to be a potentially career-destroying moment, was doing a keynote at one of the largest music conferences in the world in front of the chairman and the CEO of every record label that was worth knowing. And I told him about this thing. This is 1994, remember, this thing called the internet, and how their business plan, their business models were now broken. I thought they would receive that knowledge with some kind of gratitude, but it didn't turn out that way. They were quite angry and quite hostile. But nevertheless, I mean, the little clip there in the bottom right corner is me being interviewed on the Money program. It got that serious in lots of newspapers and all that kind of business. But also, it wasn't just music. We were doing a lot of design work. I was designing music videos, animation for feature films, some of the stuff you might recognize. Bottom right corner, there's Lost in Space. I designed the ship's computer for the film Lost in Space, a lot of the animation for that film. I mean, who wouldn't want to design a computer 5,000 years into the future? It's fantastic, right? And plus, I grew up on Lost in Space when it was Danger, Danger, Will Robinson. Anyone remember that? Oh, I go way off base. And also Ammo City, which was a YouTube meets Facebook, but about 5 years too early. I think one of my less thankful gifts really is being too early with a lot of things. Also animation for Future Sound of London. But then the last thing I did when I came back into the UK, because I've been traveling around a lot, was I decided to bring all of that knowledge together, all of those people that I'd met over a nearly 30-year career of very different industries, to start a new conversation about learning. And you can see that in the top corner there. And there was Learning Without Frontiers was an organization that brought together disparate designers, futurists, artists, academics, and so forth to have a new conversation about learning. And that left me with this question: was how would I design a school? That's me in Tokyo in 1997 being a rock star. So I thought about design and what design might mean. So I went to the Design Council website and had a look there. And they were saying design is what links creativity and innovation, which I think was interesting. A couple of words there that could be ambiguous. And it shapes ideas to become practical and attractive propositions for users and customers. Now that became more interested in terms of how you design a school. Who are the users and who are the customers? And of course, the reality is there are a number of user groups. There are children, there are parents, there's the state. There are a number of user groups. And then design may be described as creativity deployed to a specific end. And the specific end was interesting to me, because what is the specific end? If I'm designing a school, what is its purpose? What is it for? Sounds obvious, but we don't ask that question enough. What is education for? What is school for? Why do I send my kids to school? An organization's purpose shouldn't be confused with its mission statement or its vision. You know, the reality is that a mission statement is what it does. A vision is what it would like to be. But a purpose is why it does it, why it exists. Why does the school exist? What's its reason for being there? It's also, its purpose forms part of its social value, its impact on society. And everything I've heard since I've been in Dubai the last week is all about having a positive impact on society. And I mention this because actually when you create any kind of organization, whether it's a business, whether it's a social enterprise, there are three values. And I've learnt this the hard way. I have made so many mistakes in my life and had flamboyant failures in business and so forth because I haven't done this correctly. When I've done it correctly, it's wonderful. Your three values is one is your social value, your purpose, your impact. The nice thing about having a good purpose is that it attracts the best people. It attracts loyal customers, loyal organizations, and so forth. And it allows your organization to move towards a particular purpose. Commercial value, financial value, sustainability value, that's all about the resources you need to do it. And then the user value, of course, if you're not creating value for your user groups, whether it's the children, the parents, the state, if you don't create those values and you don't create them all together and lift them together, it's a tough world. But if you get them all together, use the organizational chakras, as I call them, it brings us joy. And who doesn't like joy? We all like joy, don't we? Yes. Yes. So I started looking at school mottos for a clue about what these purposes could be. And one of the schools that nearby where I was thinking about sending my daughter to when she was 11, she's now 15, had this school motto, serve and obey. That didn't work out too well. We weren't too keen on that one. We weren't sure what that meant. Maybe what they meant actually in this school was actually just do as you're told, get through the exams, and then on to university. It was an examination factory. It could mean a whole bunch of other things, particularly in English context. But there's no way my 11-year-old daughter was going to wear a badge on her blazer with serve and obey on it. So I started thinking about what kind of badge would I be happy with, and that got me into the idea of purpose. But I think they use that today, serve and obey, which I think is strange. So I thought about some of the designers that I knew and innovators I knew, and I wondered how would they design a school? How would, for example, the late Steve Jobs and Johnny Ives design a school? What would it look like? How would it be? And interesting, this building is they've almost finished this now in California, is the new Apple campus. And the top panels there are solar panels. It's in this circle. It's built within this effectively an orchard in terms of life. The point here is I'm not suggesting schools necessarily need to look like this. That school has been designed around particular ideas, perhaps around collaboration, perhaps around the flow of information, around the organization and so forth. There was an idea. It's a built environment. The idea of designing things doesn't happen by accident. And then there's Elon Musk, probably the heir apparent to Steve Jobs. How would Elon Musk, he's having a great time, isn't he? SpaceX and the Hyperloop and all that stuff. How would he design a school? Well, he's designed this factory, or his organization has, which is in the Nevada desert, which is completely energy neutral to develop his batteries and so forth for his electric cars and electric vehicles. And that tells you, again, something about the purpose in terms of how that purpose is related to design. And then there's these gentlemen. What about the Zuck and Bill Gates? What if they designed a school? Well, it turns out we have an answer to that, and it's not so good. Recently, Liberia announced the end of teaching by outsourcing its education system to a private company, which isn't in itself a bad thing necessarily. It's a for-profit US company providing education to an African state. It's also had a very hard time, of course, civil war, Ebola, and so forth. So it's a tough situation. But what worried me the most was that the way they deliver that education to these children, imagine this is your children, is by delivering education to a tablet which is used by technicians who have spent perhaps 5 weeks learning how to use the tablet and then using scripted education. This is a very thin version of education. It's a reductionist version of education. It simply thinks of education and teaching as content delivery and testing. So it effectively turns teachers into content delivery drones. And having spent a lot of time looking around the world, which we'll come to in a second, I realized there's a lot more to teaching than simply content delivery, as I'm sure you would agree. But it was not just in African states. This is something that the UK Minister for Skills and Enterprise, Matthew Hancock, said in December 2013, announcing the end of teaching, believing that the imparting of knowledge would be no longer necessary for teachers. I'm horrified by this idea. So what is school for? This is Ivan Illich, a Roman Catholic, sort of maverick social commentator, priest. He wrote a book called Deschooling Society. I recommend you read it. It's not a long read. It's a lot of fun, very prescient. He imbues education with this sort of very heavy programming, if you like, societal programming, this advertising agency. Is it for a tyranny of normal? I mentioned earlier, we have, who decided what was normal? How, something in the industrialization process at some point decided this is normal. And the problem is all those children then have to kind of, go through the homogenizing process of education and assessment to be normal. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the incidence of child and adolescent mental health conditions such as self-harming, eating disorders, depression, are on a sharp increase, not linear, hockey stick, in this fitting into being normal, and not just in education either. Is it a passport to a better life? And of course, in many cases, it is. But who controls the borders? Who controls the visas, if you like, for this passport? Is it about human capital, the sort of Singapore model? Lee Kuan Yew, when he came to power, rest in peace, Singapore was a post-colonial swamp. Had ethnic challenges, low housing, unemployment, and so forth. And they developed a plan, Singapore, that used education as part of its economic development plan to deliver the human capital, to be part of that plan. So it went through an industrial manufacturing until now it's a financial services superpower in a sense, but also with some degree of potential civil unrest because of the level of compliance within its own society. Is it about training to pass tests? Getting into a good university? Let's see what Kerry Facer from the University of Bristol has to say.
Universities are significantly changing. So if you design your education system just around the idea that it's about shuffling kids into the university setting, we're potentially in all sorts of trouble. The universities, as they are at the moment, just may not exist in that form in the next 15, 20 years. So if we're talking about educating kids now, we need to be thinking, what education do they actually need? Not how do we simply move them on the conveyor belt to the university and then ostensibly to the job. Because the simple fact is a university degree, even from the best university in the world these days, does not guarantee you security, well-being, and an income for life. We need whole different measures for how you build that sort of security.
Built the educational system to train kids to sit still long enough to work in a factory. That's what it's for, to create compliant, obedient factory workers. So the question we need to ask is, what is school for now? We're not asking that question. Parents, administrators, taxpayers are not asking the question, what is school for? I have an opinion. I think what it's not for is to create more factory workers, because we don't need more factory workers. I think what we need to do is teach kids two things. One, how to solve interesting problems, and two, how to lead. And yet if you look at just about any public school in North America or Europe, we're not teaching that. We're teaching kids how to do well on the test.
So a couple of points of view. These are interviews that I conducted around the world for the book that someone here is luckily going to win. So I thought, well, let's look at the future. What does the future look like? What do we know about the future? I mean, you hear about flying cars and self-driving cars and this and that, and everyone needs to code and blah, blah, blah. But what does the future really look like? What do we know? Now, I'm not expecting you to read it. I decided that you need to have a funny graph in like this just to impress people. But there's a few interesting things on there, like processing power, which will enable us to do very complex things, like complex model simulation, like weather, for example, or helping us personalize cancer cures directly and so forth. There's some really interesting things coming up. But how do we prepare? Because the children that are in your schools are going to live through this. There's a lot coming up for them. I'll distribute that slide. I'm going to pass on this because of the interest of time. But there are some things that we absolutely know about the future. We know, for example, that population will increase from now to 11 billion people by the end of this century. Africa, for example, will have 4 billion people. It now has 1.2. We're concerned at the moment about immigration in Europe, about 4 million people. That's nothing, really, and they're our fellow human beings. What we will see, of course, when you start combining increases in population with things like climate change, is that the climate change is going to affect the most vulnerable people on the Earth. So rather than having like 4 million people migrating, you're going to have 400 million people migrating. How are our children, the children in your schools, going to reimagine society to deal with these issues? Antibiotic resistance is going to be a thing, medicine. Differences in ideology. Massive gaps in inequality. We're seeing that happen now. An aging population. And diversity. I mean, diversity isn't actually a problem. Diversity is a gift. But these are some of the issues we know about the future. Regardless of flying cars and all that kind of business, these are the things that our children are going to have to deal with. Perhaps our education systems need to look at that. Because these are choices, aren't they? We, as human beings, as society, we have agency. We decide what happens as a human society. So the purpose of education could be, for example, this is my version, my go, is to equip them with the skills to reimagine society to meet the challenges of their generation. It's not about us anymore. It's about them. I was talking to some children on Saturday morning and they wanted to stop wars, which is a great idea, right? So I said, well, let's get rid of passports. Let's get rid of borders. Would we allow them to do that? Would we stand in their way? Perhaps a better purpose is for the benefit of all things, for our planet. And I think, the last few days this has been resonating, I think, from what I've been hearing just naturally with the people that I've met in Dubai. So I went traveling. And that's when I ended up developing this book, was the two-year research program, going to a variety of places around the world, 18 countries, 6 continents, a lot of air miles. I was living in refugee camps on the Syrian-Jordan border. I was up a mountain in China after the earthquake. I was out in rural Bahar, to where there was zero literacy, zero power, zero media, the whole thing. Then I would find myself in the offices of Google and Facebook, and then sitting in schools in the US and fantastic schools in Lebanon and in Dubai and so forth, and understanding what was happening amongst those practitioner communities about what they were doing that was working. And I also met a huge number of really interesting people, some of the obvious suspects, people like Ken Robinson and so forth. Sorry about that, let me just go back. Noam Chomsky, Sagar Tomitra, Mitch Resnick, the developer of Scrap. A whole host of people. And I learned about things about context. Context, how you deliver education has context. In Ghana, for example, one of the problems in West Africa, in Ghana, was the cost of books. As a post-colonial society, its pedagogy was based around textbooks. And you could have said, okay, let's change all that, let's put iPads in. It would be enormously expensive, and how would you train all the teachers and so forth? We'd be pushing water up a hill. The problem was the books, moving books around in Ghana was very expensive. So an organization called World Reader delivered to children the cheapest paperwhite Kindles, the little sort of $50 ones, which you could read in sunlight, and the battery would last for a whole week, and they could take 1,000 books. And so teachers could then teach because the kids had all the books. I mean, a massive change, very inexpensively. So context is always important. Environment, super important. The schools that I saw working really well, whether it was the UNICEF schools in Zatari, in the refugee camp, or RDFZ school in Beijing, or High Tech High in the US, they're all listed in my book. These schools where sometimes it was difficult to see where the classroom finished and the common area started, and also the relationship between the teacher and the child. It wasn't this sort of command and control. It was much more collegial between them. And this was happening everywhere that I went, the schools that I visited. And the environment, what I mean by environment, was environment designed for collaboration. I'm sure most of you have been inside the KHDA building. That is an environment designed for collaboration. In my belief, that's what a school should look like. Engagement. This sounds obvious, doesn't it? Engagement. But I'm not talking about just student engagement, which is obviously important, but I'm talking about teacher engagement. It doesn't matter how much technology you have. is the teacher is at the center. Because you can't reduce teaching, as you know, simply to content delivery and testing. There is so much more involved in the human interaction. And what I saw, no matter where I went, whether it was in the middle of a war zone, after an earthquake, in a high-tech environment, teachers surrounded by technology, but at the end of the day, it was the teacher and the engagement of the teacher. And yet I don't believe globally we teach teachers with anything like enough respect and enough support. Teaching is not a delivery system. I don't know when when teaching suddenly became FedEx. Here's the content. There's much more to that. This is the research that came from Gallup, found that only 30% of K through 12 teachers were engaged in their work, leading to 1.4 million absentee days per annum, which led to a suboptimal learning environment. This is horrific. This is a big, in any other profession, this would be a national emergency. And yet we also have a massive shortage after the SDGs. It's a massive shortage. And yet we see this turning it into a delivery system, disengaging teachers and so forth, not raising the profession. This is some newspaper coverage from the UK, but you can find this in lots of countries. Morale, because teachers are now having to spend so much time evidencing their practice, they haven't got time to practice. Super crazy. What are we doing? Technology. Now I come back, my whole background, as you saw, was technology. I love technology. And Seymour Papert really turned me on to technology in terms of what it could do. And I still believe that, but I regret that the technology we're seeing being deployed in many cases within education is often the sort of technology that does what industrial technology does. It creates efficiencies within an existing system. So we're using technology in many cases just to reinforce 19th century practice. So hence the Liberia example, or indeed the example that the British minister was talking about, which was using technology to impart the knowledge, to do drill and kill, rote learning, and then to get you through that test. That, my friends, is not learning. That, my friends, is not a good use of technology, in my opinion. These things, big data, algorithms, learning analytics, fantastic tools in the hands of an experienced practitioner, not a replacement for them. Otherwise, you end up with this. You know what this is, right? You can stand on it, you can walk on it, but it always gets you to the same place. Someone once described to me technology as a sat-nav for learning. Sounds good when you say it quickly and don't think about it, right? But remember what a sat-nav does. Sat-nav prevents you getting lost. Sat-nav gets you from one part of the town to the other in the quickest possible time. The other day when I left the PMO's office, they wanted to get me a taxi. I said, no, thank you. I want to walk. Why do you want to walk? Because I want to get lost. Why do I want to get lost? Because I found this fantastic Lebanese restaurant. This is why I got lost, because I didn't even know it was there. And that's the point, getting lost. You find things, you discover things that you didn't know you like. You meet people that you didn't know. You find music that you don't like. And learning, I believe, should be like that, not something that's corralled to get you to that end point, which seems to be passing tests. And that goes back to this gentleman called Frederick Taylor, a management consultant from the US, way back in the beginning of the last century, who really talked about measuring everything and having the sole purpose of measuring everything to a point so you could replicate and scale it, which is great if you're making cars or spoons or any kind of standardized product. But in a world where we have all those challenges that I talked about earlier, is that what we want, this standardized output from our schools? Of course not. Because the beauty of our species is the diversity and the difference and the skills that we bring to the party. Seymour Papert later wrote this, and what he was saying was really that the dream that he sold me when I was driving around with blue hair about transforming education, the computers had been subverted, the technology had been subverted to just simply reinforce rather than change. And I'll pass this around later, but it's just the different ways of looking at technology and education. So education plus technology doesn't equal transformation. You can't just layer technology. I've seen so many schools that thought, you know what, how do we impress the parents? I know, we'll give them all iPads. And then not change the way they learn and teach, which strikes me as crazy. And then finally, assessment. Assessment is the tail that wags the dog of learning. We talk about collaboration, don't we? We talk about creativity and happiness and all these things. And yet, when it comes to an examination, we sit kids 3 feet apart from each other. They're not allowed to share their answers. They can't take a computer into the examination. I mean, this is crazy. What's going on? I mean, at least the Victorians allowed Victorian technology into the examination room. You could take a pen and a pencil and all those things. And yet today, preparing kids for the 21st century, it's like the 21st century never happened. So the purpose, no matter what purpose, and on all my travels, when I was trying to find how I would design a school and talk to experts and go to fantastic schools around the world, they had this wonderful purpose. And then we always came to this point was that, yes, but we then have these state exams that we have to get them through. It was like taking the kids and transporting them to the Victorian age. Imagine if you changed the assessment method. Imagine if you made it mandatory, compulsory, that every child went into examination had to take an internet-connected digital device. And they had to talk to each other. And they had to share their answers. And they had to work together. Imagine the skills and the competencies that we would be understanding about those individuals. Now, the person that gets a Nobel Prize isn't the one that read the most books. And yet that's what we're looking for. We're trying to get kids to pass tests, to regurgitate stuff from their memory and not work together collaboratively. And it's 2016. So the question really is, for those of you involved in school design and school management and school leadership and teaching, is where is your North Star? Where is your purpose? Why are you here? Why do you do what you do? Why does the school exist? Ask yourself those questions. And this is my starter for 10. I think the purpose is for the benefit of all. But you're very welcome to make up your own. Thank you very much. Now, it's a bit you've all been waiting for, the prize. Okay, so I was talking about the person who was behind the educational philosophy known as constructionism. Who was that person? I think it was the lady here that I heard first. So congratulations to the lady here. And sorry, I would jump down, but I might. Thank you very much.